"The house is sold. You need to be out by the weekend." My mother-in-law Gloria said it so casually that for a moment I thought I had misheard her. The late afternoon sun hung low over the neighborhood, casting long shadows across the driveway. I stood beside my car holding my purse and a leather folder that contained a copy of my father's will. Just an hour earlier I had been crying not from grief but from relief. My father, Franklin Reed, had passed away 3 weeks before. He was 80 years old and had lived a long life, but losing him still felt like losing the strongest pillar in my world. That afternoon, during the reading of his will, I learned he had left me $6 million and his lakefront mansion in Lake Tahoe. $6 million. Even now, standing in my driveway, the number felt unreal. I had spent the entire drive home imagining how Richard would react. After years of financial stress and endless compromises, maybe we could finally breathe. Maybe we could travel, maybe we could stop worrying, maybe life was about to become easier. Instead, my husband stood beside his mother holding a stack of divorce papers, and my mother-in-law was informing me that I was homeless. I looked from Gloria to Richard, then back to Gloria. "What do you mean the house is sold?" Gloria crossed her arms. "The buyers take possession next week." My stomach tightened. "What buyers?" Richard finally spoke, his voice sounding rehearsed. "Margaret, let's not make this harder than it has to be." Harder, the word echoed strangely in my head. I stared at him, my husband of 27 years, the man who once drove through a snowstorm to bring me medicine when I had pneumonia, the man who used to leave notes in my lunch bag when we were young and broke. Now he couldn't even look me in the eye. I glanced past them toward the house. Something felt wrong immediately. The flower pots I had placed beside the front door were gone. The porch swing Richard built 10 years ago had disappeared. Even the curtains in the front windows were different. A cold realization spread through me. This hadn't happened today. This had been planned carefully, quietly for weeks, maybe longer. Gloria stepped forward and extended the papers toward me. "You should sign while everyone is still being civilized." Civilized? I almost laughed. Instead, I asked the only question that mattered. "When were you going to tell me?" Richard rubbed the back of his neck, his favorite nervous habit. "We didn't know how." I stared at him. "You sold our house." Silence. "You filed for divorce." More silence. "And neither of you thought I deserved a conversation." Gloria rolled her eyes. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Margaret, stop acting like a victim." There it was, the same tone she had used for nearly 3 decades, always polite enough to avoid criticism, always cruel enough to leave a bruise. When I first met Gloria, I was 20 years old. She disliked me immediately, though not openly. Women like Gloria never operated openly. They preferred subtle cuts, tiny insults disguised as compliments. "Margaret is sweet, but Richard could have done better. Margaret is hardworking, but she's not exactly ambitious. Margaret is nice enough, but she's so emotional." Little comments year after year, and every single time Richard defended her. "That's not what she meant. She's just being honest. You know how Mom is." Eventually those excuses became part of our marriage. I looked at Richard now and suddenly realized something painful. He was still making excuses for her even now, even after everything. "Why?" I asked quietly. Richard looked away, but Gloria answered for him. "Because this marriage has been over for years." The confidence in her voice caught my attention. Not confidence, certainty, as though she had already won. I glanced down at the divorce papers. Neither of them noticed that I wasn't crying, I wasn't yelling, and I wasn't begging. The strange thing was that I felt remarkably calm. It wasn't because I wasn't hurt, but something about the situation felt unfinished, like I was missing a piece of information. Gloria pointed toward the street. "You should leave before the buyers arrive." The buyers. Yes, Richard finally looked directly at me. "The house sold 3 days ago." 3 days. 3 days earlier I had been sitting beside my father's hospital bed, holding his hand during his final hours. 3 days earlier my husband had apparently been selling our home behind my back. Something inside me should have shattered. Instead, another memory surfaced, a conversation with my father 6 months earlier. We had been sitting on the deck of his Lake Tahoe home watching the water. Out of nowhere, he had said something strange. "People show you who they really are when they think you have nothing left to offer." At the time, I thought he was talking about business. Now I wasn't so sure. Gloria interrupted my thoughts by pushing the papers closer. "You can sign now or later." Richard nodded. "It's over, Margaret. Over, just like that, 27 years reduced to a single word." I studied both of them carefully. Gloria looked satisfied, Richard looked uncomfortable, and neither of them looked worried. This meant they believed they had already won. That realization made something unexpected happen. I smiled. A real smile. Richard frowned immediately. "What's so funny?" The wind moved gently through the trees. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then I looked at the house behind them. The house they believed they had sold the house. They believed they controlled, and quietly I said, "My father always had excellent instincts." Gloria narrowed her eyes. "What does that mean?" I slipped the leather folder under my arm. "It means if Dad suspected this was coming," I paused, "then there's a very good chance he prepared for it." For the first time all afternoon, Gloria's expression changed only slightly, but just enough for me to notice. Standing there in the driveway, I suddenly realized something important. For the first time in 27 years, I wasn't the one who felt trapped. I spent that night in a hotel 15 minutes away. It wasn't because I had nowhere else to go. It was because I needed silence, real silence. The kind that lets you hear your own thoughts after years of listening to everyone else's. The room overlooked a busy intersection in Reno. Cars moved through the evening traffic below while I sat on the edge of the bed staring at my phone. Richard had called 12 times. Gloria had called twice. I ignored every call. Around 9 o'clock, another number appeared on the screen. I recognized it immediately: Ethan Mercer, my father's attorney, and one of his closest friends. I answered. "Margaret." His voice sounded gentle. "Tough day." I laughed softly. "You could say that." There was a pause, then he said something unexpected. "Your father wanted me to contact you if certain things happened." I sat up straighter. "What things?" Another pause. "The divorce." The room suddenly felt very still. I stared at the wall across from me. "What?" "Your father was worried." The knot in my stomach tightened. "Worried about what?" Ethan exhaled slowly. "Not over the phone. That is all I will say." We agreed to meet the next morning. After hanging up, I barely slept. It wasn't because of Richard or Gloria, it was because of my father. The idea that he had anticipated any of this felt impossible, yet somehow it also felt exactly like him. Franklin Reed had spent 40 years building a real estate empire across Northern California and Nevada. He trusted very few people, but when he trusted someone, he trusted them completely. And when he doubted someone, he quietly prepared. The next morning, I drove to Ethan's office. His building sat near the Truckee River, a modest brick structure that looked more like an old library than a law office. Ethan greeted me personally. At 72, he moved more slowly than he once had, but his sharp blue eyes missed nothing. He guided me into a private conference room where coffee waited on the table alongside a large manila envelope. My heart immediately sped up. Ethan sat down across from me. "Before we start," he said carefully, "I need you to understand something." I nodded. "Your father loved you very much." The words hit harder than I expected. I looked away for a moment, unable to speak. Finally, I managed a small smile. "I know. He worried about you." That made me look up. "Worried," Ethan nodded. "He worried that you spent too much time protecting other people." The statement landed uncomfortably close to home. Ethan slid the envelope toward me. "Your father left this with specific instructions." I stared at it. My name appeared across the front in my father's handwriting, and the sight alone nearly broke me. It read times, "For Margaret, if Richard and Gloria finally reveal themselves." A chill ran through my body. I looked at Ethan. He knew. Ethan folded his hands. He suspected. I carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. The familiar handwriting immediately transported me back to childhood birthday cards, notes tucked into lunchboxes, and letters sent during college. For a moment I could almost hear his voice as my eyes moved across the page times. "Margaret, if you're reading this, then Richard and Gloria have finally shown you who they are." I stopped, my chest tightening. Ethan remained silent. I continued reading. "This may hurt. I wish I were wrong, but if this letter reached you, then I wasn't. I know you love deeply, you always have. You believe people can become better if they're given enough patience. Your mother believed that too." The room blurred briefly. I blinked several times before continuing. "Richard is not an evil man." That surprised me. I had expected anger, condemnation. Instead, my father continued times. "Richard's greatest weakness has always been that he let stronger personalities make decisions for him, and Gloria has spent her entire life making decisions for other people." I lowered the paper slowly. The description was painfully accurate. For years I had blamed Gloria for everything. Maybe she deserved most of it, but Richard had made choices too. Every time he stayed silent, every time he looked away, every time he allowed someone else to speak for him. My father had seen that long before I did. The letter continued times. "You may discover information in the coming weeks that surprises you. Do not rush, do not sign anything immediately, and most importantly, do not underestimate your own position." I frowned. My own position, what did that mean? I looked at Ethan. He seemed to anticipate the question. "Keep reading." So I did. Several paragraphs later, another sentence stopped me cold times. If Richard ever attempts to dispose of property connected to our family arrangements, contact Ethan immediately. Family arrangements, I looked up again. What family arrangements? Ethan leaned back in his chair. That's the interesting part. He reached into a briefcase and removed several folders. My pulse quickened. Your father established a trust. A trust. Several, actually. I stared at him. Why didn't he tell me? Because he wasn't ready. That answer only created more questions. Ethan opened the first folder. Inside were documents, property records, financial statements, and legal agreements representing years of paperwork. Your father began restructuring portions of his estate almost 8 years ago. 8 years ago. I froze at that memory. I remembered Richard's construction business had struggled after several failed projects. We came dangerously close to losing everything, and the stress nearly destroyed us. Eventually things stabilized. Richard told me he had refinanced several assets and secured additional funding. I never questioned it. Apparently I should have. Ethan tapped one document. Your father became more involved than you realized. I stared at the papers. How involved? Ethan hesitated. Then he said something that changed everything. Let's just say your father wasn't comfortable trusting Richard with complete control. The room felt smaller suddenly. Dozens of memories rearranged themselves in my mind, conversations, warnings, comments I hadn't understood. My father had never openly criticized Richard, not once, but he had always observed, always watched, and always taken notes. The realization sent a strange mixture of sadness and gratitude through me. Even now, even after his death, he was still trying to protect me. My phone vibrated. Richard again. I silenced it. Ethan noticed. He'll keep calling. I know. Gloria too. I nodded. Ethan closed one folder and opened another. This is where things become complicated. The word complicated immediately got my attention. Complicated how? For the first time that morning, Ethan smiled, not a reassuring smile, but a knowing one the kind lawyers wear when they already understand the ending. Margaret, he said quietly, there is something Richard and Gloria don't know. My heartbeat accelerated. What? Ethan looked directly at me. The house they sold, he paused, then finished the sentence, was never entirely theirs to sell. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. And for the first time since standing in that driveway yesterday, I saw the faint outline of something I hadn't felt in a very long time: hope. The next 48 hours passed in a blur. Richard continued calling, sometimes 10 times a day, sometimes 20. I ignored every call, not because I wanted revenge, but because for the first time in years I wanted space to think before reacting. That alone felt unfamiliar. For most of my marriage, I had been the person who smoothed things over, the person who returned calls first, the person who apologized first, the person who fixed problems I didn't create. Now, I was tired, and exhaustion has a way of clarifying priorities. On Thursday morning, Ethan called. Can you come in? His voice sounded different, more focused. Something happened. My stomach tightened immediately. What? The buyers discovered a problem. I was in my car less than 20 minutes later. When I arrived at Ethan's office, he was already waiting in the conference room. Several folders lay open across the table. A younger attorney sat beside him whom I recognized from my father's memorial service, Jason Cole, a real estate litigation specialist. Neither man looked relaxed. That told me enough. I sat down. What happened? Jason exchanged a glance with Ethan, then he answered, The buyers hired attorneys to review the transaction. Normal procedure. Very, I nodded. So what's the problem? Jason slid a document toward me. The ownership structure. I looked down at the page. Most of the legal language meant nothing to me. Years ago I would have pretended otherwise, but age had cured me of that habit. I need the English version. Jason smiled faintly. Fair. He pointed toward several highlighted sections. The buyers assumed Richard owned 100% of the property. He didn't. No, a strange sensation moved through me, part relief, part confusion, part disbelief. Jason continued, At some point during the refinancing process 8 years ago, your father became involved. I remembered that difficult period immediately. Richard's company had been drowning lawsuits, debt, missed contracts, late payments. There were nights I sat awake wondering whether we'd lose everything. Then suddenly the crisis ended. At the time I believed Richard had solved it. Now I wasn't so sure. Jason opened another folder. This transaction wasn't a simple refinance. What was it? A rescue. The word landed heavily. Ethan leaned forward. Your father injected several $1 million into the situation. I stared at him. Several million, not even close. Why wouldn't he tell me? Because he didn't want you caught between loyalty to him and loyalty to your husband. That sounded exactly like my father, always protecting people from uncomfortable truths, sometimes too much. Jason continued. In exchange for that financial support, Franklin secured legal protections. What kind of protections? He tapped the document. Ownership interests. The room became very quiet. I stared at the paperwork slowly, carefully, trying to understand. You're saying Dad became part owner, indirectly, of our house? Partially. I leaned back in my chair. For several seconds I couldn't speak. The house, Richard had sold the house, Gloria had thrown me out of the house they both believed belonged entirely to them, suddenly looked very different. Ethan watched me carefully. You all right? I nodded. I think so. Then I laughed softly. It wasn't because anything was funny, but because life occasionally becomes so absurd that laughter is the only reasonable response. 3 days ago I thought I was homeless. Now I wasn't even sure the sale was legal. My phone buzzed. Richard again. I turned the screen face down. Ethan didn't comment. Jason continued explaining the documents. The structure was complicated: trust agreements, protected interests, conditional ownership rights, enough legal language to fill a library. But one fact became increasingly clear. My father had never fully trusted Richard, and more importantly, he had prepared accordingly. That realization hurt more than I expected, not because of the money, but because I wondered how many warning signs Dad had seen that I ignored. How many times had he looked at Richard and noticed weakness? How many conversations had he chosen not to have because he knew I wouldn't want to hear them? Our thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the conference room door. Jason's assistant stepped inside. Mr. Mercer. Ethan looked up. What is it? The buyer's attorney is on line 1. Jason immediately stood. Put him through. The assistant disappeared, and within moments the speakerphone activated. A voice filled the room, professional, controlled, and slightly irritated. Good morning. Jason introduced everyone, and then the attorney got straight to the point. My clients have serious concerns. It wasn't surprising. Nobody likes discovering complications after spending millions of dollars. Jason nodded. Understandable. Understandable doesn't begin to cover it. The attorney sounded increasingly frustrated. We now have evidence that protected interests connected to the property were never properly disclosed. My pulse quickened. Even though I wasn't responsible, even though I had known nothing, the situation still felt surreal. Jason remained calm. We're reviewing everything. You should review quickly. The attorney paused, then added the sentence that changed the atmosphere instantly. My clients are considering suspending the entire transaction. Silence. Heavy silence. Even through the speakerphone I could feel the tension. The attorney continued. If these documents prove accurate, the sale may be legally challenged. Across the table, Ethan folded his hands. For the first time I saw genuine satisfaction in his expression, not because he wanted anyone harmed, but because the truth was finally surfacing. After several more minutes, the call ended. Nobody spoke immediately. Jason closed the file. Ethan removed his glasses, and I sat there trying to absorb everything. Finally, I asked the question that had been bothering me. What happens now? Jason answered. Now everyone gets nervous. That wasn't the legal explanation I expected, but somehow it felt correct. I imagined Richard. I imagined Gloria, both of them sitting comfortably inside their certainty, convinced they had already won, convinced they controlled the outcome. And somewhere in Lake Tahoe, paperwork was quietly dismantling that certainty piece by piece. My phone rang again. Richard. This time a voicemail appeared seconds later, then another, then a text times. Please call me, it's important. I stared at the screen. 3 days ago I had stood in the driveway while he handed me divorce papers. Now suddenly things were important. Interesting, very interesting. Ethan noticed my expression. Richard? I nodded. What should I do? Ethan smiled slightly. Nothing. Nothing for now. He stood and walked toward the window overlooking the river. Outside, sunlight reflected off the water, and cars moved through downtown Reno. Life continued normally, as if nobody's world was unraveling. Ethan turned back toward me. Margaret, your father used to tell me something. What a small smile crossed his face. He said, greedy people make excellent mistakes. I laughed softly. That sounded exactly like Franklin Reed. Ethan nodded toward the stack of documents. Your father spent years preparing for this possibility. I looked at the files, at the signatures, at the protections, at the quiet planning that had happened behind the scenes. Then I thought about Gloria's face when she told me to leave before the buyers arrived, the confidence, the certainty, the contempt. For the first time since this nightmare began, I found myself wondering something entirely different, not whether Richard and Gloria would face consequences, but whether they had any idea how much trouble was already heading toward them. By Friday afternoon, the first cracks had begun to appear, not in the legal documents, not in the property records, but in Richard. For 3 days, his messages had followed the same pattern: times, please call me, we need to talk, this isn't what you think. Then around 4 o'clock, a different text arrived. Times, Mom didn't tell me everything. I stared at the screen for several seconds, then I set the phone aside without replying. Whether Gloria had told him everything or not no longer mattered. He had still signed the papers. He had still sold the house. He had still watched me stand in that driveway and said nothing. Some choices don't disappear just because someone regrets them afterward. An hour later, Ethan called. I think we found something. His tone immediately got my attention. What kind of something? The kind your father expected us to find. 20 minutes later, I was back in his office. This time, 3 folders sat open across the conference table. Jason was already there. Neither man looked surprised anymore. They looked focused, like investigators assembling the final pieces of a puzzle. Ethan pointed toward a stack of bank records. Have you ever reviewed your household finances in detail? I laughed softly. No. Why not? The answer came too quickly. Richard handled them. The moment I said it, I hated how familiar it sounded. For years that had been my answer. Richard handled the investments, Richard handled the taxes, Richard handled the accounts. Meanwhile, I handled everything else: the home, the schedules, the birthdays, the holidays, the emotional labor. Looking back, the division suddenly seemed less balanced than I once believed. Jason slid several statements toward me. We traced a series of transfers. I glanced down. Rows of numbers covered the pages, dates, accounts, transactions. At first glance, they meant nothing. Then Jason highlighted one section. These withdrawals began shortly after the refinancing. My eyes moved down the page, thousands of dollars, then tens of thousands, then more. My stomach tightened. Where did it go? Jason opened another file. That's the interesting part. He rotated the folder toward me. Several account numbers appeared along with a name, Gloria Dawson. For a moment, I simply stared. The room seemed strangely quiet. What am I looking at? Jason answered carefully. Money transferred from business-related accounts into investments associated with Gloria. I looked at Ethan, then back at the documents, then back at Ethan again. How much? Nobody answered immediately. That frightened me more than any number. Finally, Jason spoke. Over 8 years, he glanced at the records, just over $900,000. The air left my lungs. $900,000. I sat back slowly, not because I couldn't understand the number, but because I could very clearly. The room blurred for a moment, not from tears but from realization. While Richard and I were cutting expenses, while I was working summer programs for extra income, while we postponed vacations, while we worried about bills, nearly $1 million had quietly moved elsewhere. And somehow, I knew exactly what came next. I looked at Jason. Did Richard know? The attorney exchanged a glance with Ethan. Some of it. Some. We're still determining the full picture. That answer told me everything. Richard knew enough. Maybe not everything, but enough. Enough to stay silent, enough to look away, enough to let it continue. The familiar disappointment settled into my chest, not sharp anymore, just heavy, the weight of understanding someone completely. Ethan folded his hands. There's another problem. I almost laughed. Of course there was. What now? Jason opened a third folder. The investments. A strange expression crossed his face, part disbelief, part amusement. Neither reassured me. What about them? They performed terribly. I blinked. What? Most of them lost money. I stared. Jason nodded. Some lost a lot. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then the absurdity finally hit me. Gloria had spent years convincing Richard to move money, years manipulating him, years treating everyone else as if they were fools, and the investments had failed badly. I couldn't help it. I laughed a short, tired laugh. Ethan smiled slightly. You all right? Honestly, I shook my head. No. But apparently I'm developing a very strange sense of humor. For the first time that afternoon, both attorneys laughed. Then Ethan grew serious again. Margaret, there's something important you need to understand. I nodded. Your father suspected this. The statement didn't surprise me anymore. What exactly did he suspect? Ethan opened a notebook, one I immediately recognized. My father's handwriting filled every page, dates, observations, notes, careful records. The sight made my throat tighten. He documented concerns for years. I stared at the notebook. Dad kept notes. He kept records. Ethan turned several pages. One entry caught my attention immediately. Times Gloria influences every major financial decision. Richard rarely challenges her. Another, Margaret assumes compromise is the same thing as peace. That one hurt because it was true, painfully true. Ethan turned another page, then another, finally stopping at an entry dated almost 2 years earlier. He slid the notebook toward me. I read silently. Time's greed eventually creates carelessness. Wait long enough and people reveal themselves. I sat motionless. The words sounded exactly like my father, patient, observant, never dramatic, just accurate. My phone buzzed again. This time I looked. Richard. A voicemail appeared immediately afterward. Without thinking, I played it. His voice filled the room. Margaret, please call me. Something's happening. Mom and I had a disagreement. A disagreement. The understatement almost made me smile. The message continued. Times I think she hid things from me. Please just call. The recording ended. Silence settled across the room. Jason slowly leaned back. Well, what do you know? I'd say the alliance is weakening. The phrase sounded oddly clinical but accurate. I imagined Gloria. For years she had controlled every room she entered, every conversation, every decision, every relationship. Now the consequences were arriving, and suddenly loyalty was becoming expensive. People reveal themselves when money disappears. My father had been right about that too. Ethan stood and walked toward the window. Outside, evening sunlight reflected across the river. After a moment he spoke. Do you know what impresses me most about Franklin? I shook my head. He never tried to punish anyone. I frowned. What do you mean? He could have exposed all of this years ago. Ethan looked back at me. But he didn't. Why not? Because he wasn't interested in revenge, Ethan continued. He was interested in protection. I looked down at the notebook, at the letters, at the documents, at years of preparation, and suddenly I understood. My father hadn't spent years building a trap. He had spent years building a safety net. The trap belonged to someone else. Gloria and Richard had created that themselves. All Franklin had done was make sure I wouldn't fall with them. And somewhere across town, I suspected Gloria Dawson was beginning to realize exactly how expensive her mistakes might become. By Monday morning, the situation had moved beyond uncomfortable. It had become dangerous not for me but for Richard and Gloria. I was sitting on the balcony of my hotel room overlooking the river when Ethan called. The moment I heard his voice, I knew something significant had happened. They froze the transaction. I set my coffee down. The buyers, completely. A strange calm washed over me, not satisfaction, just certainty. The avalanche had finally started. What happens now? Ethan exhaled slowly. Now the lawyers get involved. That afternoon I attended my first meeting with the buyer's legal team. The conference room felt colder than usual, maybe because nobody was pretending anymore. The buyers were angry, understandably so. They had spent millions of dollars on a property they believed was clean and uncomplicated. Now they were discovering trust agreements, ownership interests, disclosure issues, and enough legal uncertainty to make anyone nervous. Richard sat across the table. For the first time since our marriage began, he looked genuinely frightened, not embarrassed, not uncomfortable, but frightened. Gloria sat beside him, still perfectly dressed, still composed, still trying desperately to look like she controlled the situation. But I noticed small things, the way her fingers tapped against the table, the way she checked her phone every few minutes, the way she avoided eye contact with certain attorneys. Tiny cracks, tiny signs of pressure. The meeting lasted nearly 3 hours. Most of the legal discussion went over my head: ownership percentages, disclosure obligations, potential liability, civil exposure. Legal jargon flowed endlessly around the room, but one message became clear: the house sale was no longer a simple real estate transaction. It was becoming a legal nightmare. During a short break, Richard approached me near the coffee station. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The silence felt strange. Once upon a time, we could feel silence comfortably. Now every pause felt loaded. Finally, he spoke. You look good. I almost smiled. After everything that had happened, that was what he chose to say. You don't. The honesty surprised both of us. Richard laughed quietly, a tired laugh. I probably deserve that. I studied him carefully. He looked older than he had a week earlier, not physically but emotionally, like someone carrying weight he could no longer ignore. Margaret, his voice softened. I never wanted this. The statement immediately irritated me, not because it was false, but because it was incomplete. You signed the papers. His shoulders dropped. I know. You sold the house. I know. You watched your mother throw me out. His eyes closed briefly. I know. The conversation ended there because there was nothing else to say. Knowledge after the fact changes very little. When we returned to the conference room, the atmosphere had shifted. One of the attorneys had uncovered additional financial records, more transfers, more documentation, more evidence. The deeper they looked, the worse everything became. Around 4 o'clock, the discussion turned toward the business accounts. That was when Gloria made her first serious mistake. She lost her temper, not completely, just enough. An attorney was explaining several investment transfers when she interrupted. "This is ridiculous." The room immediately went quiet. Nobody likes interruptions from people already under scrutiny. The attorney remained professional. "Mrs. Dawson." Gloria leaned forward. "Those investments were private." "No, ma'am," the attorney's tone remained calm. "They became relevant once business funds entered the equation." Gloria's face tightened. Richard approved those transfers. Every head in the room turned toward Richard. For a moment he simply stared at her, almost like he couldn't believe what he had just heard. Then something changed, something I had never seen before. He pushed back. "You told me they were temporary." The room became very still. Gloria blinked. Apparently she hadn't expected resistance. "Richard, you said the money would come back," his expression hardened. "I was protecting our future." "No." The word came out stronger than expected. Even Richard looked surprised. For the first time in 27 years, he wasn't talking to me, he wasn't talking to an employee, he wasn't talking to a contractor, he was talking to his mother, and he was disagreeing with her. The attorneys wisely stayed silent. Nobody wanted to interrupt history. Gloria crossed her arms. "If you had listened to me more often, none of this would have happened." The sentence hung in the air, heavy, ugly, revealing. And suddenly, I understood something she genuinely believed, that even now, even after everything, even after the lawsuits, the investigations, and the financial losses, she still believed the problem wasn't manipulation. The problem was insufficient obedience. Richard stared at her, then he laughed, not happily, not kindly, but bitterly, a sound I had never heard from him before. "You really believe that?" For the first time all afternoon, Gloria looked uncertain only for a second, but it was enough. The meeting ended shortly afterward. Outside the building, rain had started falling, small drops tapping against the pavement while people hurried toward their cars. I stood beneath the awning waiting for Ethan. Across the parking lot, Richard and Gloria were arguing, not quietly, not privately, but openly. The distance prevented me from hearing the words, but I didn't need them. Their body language told the story: years of cooperation, years of shared secrets, years of mutual manipulation all unraveling. My father had predicted it perfectly. Greed is loyal only until consequences arrive. Ethan joined me a moment later. He followed my gaze toward Richard and Gloria. "Interesting." I nodded. "Very." For a few moments we watched silently, then Ethan spoke. "You know what's happening, don't you?" "What?" "They're running out of people to blame." The observation struck me immediately. For years, Gloria blamed everyone else: employees, lawyers, banks, markets, friends, family, anyone except herself. Now the circle had narrowed. Eventually it would reach its center, and that center looked increasingly uncomfortable. That evening, back at the hotel, I received another voicemail from Richard. This one sounded different. No excuses, no explanations, no attempts to negotiate, just exhaustion. "Margaret." A long pause, then "Times I need to tell you something." I listened carefully. His next words stopped me cold. "I thought if you lost everything." Another pause, longer this time. "Times you wouldn't leave." I sat frozen. The recording continued. "I know how terrible that sounds." Yes, it did. Horrible, actually. But the worst part wasn't the confession. The worst part was that I believed him. It wasn't because he hated me. It was because he was afraid of being alone, afraid of disappointing his mother, afraid of losing control, afraid of making decisions. Fear had quietly shaped his life for years, and now it had finally destroyed it. I deleted the voicemail. Then I walked onto the balcony. The rain had stopped. City lights reflected across the dark water below. For a long time I stood there thinking about my father, about the letters, about the trust, about everything he had done. And eventually I realized something important. The greatest gift he left me wasn't $6 million. It wasn't the mansion in Lake Tahoe. It wasn't even the legal protections. It was clarity, the kind that arrives only after the truth becomes impossible to ignore. And for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't afraid of what came next. 3 days later, I drove to Lake Tahoe. The morning sky was clear and the mountains seemed impossibly still as I followed the winding roads toward my father's estate. For most of the drive, I kept the radio off. I wanted the quiet not because I was sad, but because everything inside me was changing and I needed room to understand it. The previous week had felt like living through an earthquake. A marriage had collapsed, a house sale had unraveled, and family secrets had surfaced. Yet strangely, I felt calmer than I had in years, not happy, not healed, just steady, like someone finally standing on solid ground after years of walking across ice. The gates appeared around noon, black wrought iron framed by tall pine trees, the same gates I had passed through hundreds of times during my father's life. As they opened, emotion tightened unexpectedly in my throat. This time he wouldn't be waiting, no wave from the porch, no coffee already brewing, no terrible joke about me driving too slowly. Just silence. The estate sat beside the lake exactly as I remembered. The water stretched endlessly beyond the property, reflecting sunlight like polished glass. My father always loved that view. He used to say it reminded him that some things remained steady no matter how chaotic life became. I understood that better now. Ben Carson, the caretaker, greeted me at the front entrance. He was 63, broad-shouldered, and had worked for my father for nearly 20 years. When he saw me, his expression softened. "Miss Margaret." Nobody had called me that since Dad died. The simple words nearly broke me. Ben shook my hand. "I'm sorry about your father." I nodded. "Thank you." For a moment neither of us spoke, then Ben smiled gently. "He was proud of you." The statement hit harder than expected, not because I doubted it, but because I suddenly realized how much I missed hearing it. Inside the house felt exactly the same, the scent of cedarwood, the polished hardwood floors, the grandfather clock near the staircase. Every detail remained familiar, and yet everything felt different because the one person who made it feel like home was gone. Ben carried my bags upstairs while I wandered through the rooms. Eventually I found myself standing inside my father's study. The room looked untouched. Bookshelves lined the walls, photographs sat neatly arranged across the desk, a leather chair faced the window overlooking the lake, and sitting directly in the center of the desk was another envelope. Of course there was. I laughed quietly, a tired laugh, a grateful one. Even after death, Franklin Reed was somehow still organizing my life. I sat down in his chair and picked up the envelope. The handwriting was unmistakable times, for Margaret, when everything becomes clear. My chest tightened. Slowly I opened it. Inside was another handwritten letter. I unfolded the pages carefully. "Margaret, if you're reading this from my study, then the storm has probably passed. Not completely, but enough." I smiled despite myself. That sounded exactly like him, practical, measured, never dramatic. The letter continued. "You may be tempted to focus on the money. Please don't. Money solves problems, but it rarely teaches lessons. The real gift is understanding." I leaned back and continued reading. "For years I watched you carry responsibilities that were never yours. You apologized when others failed, you compromised when others demanded, you sacrificed when others expected. Eventually that becomes a habit, and habits become identities." I stared at the page. The words felt uncomfortably accurate because they described my marriage perfectly. For years I had mistaken endurance for love, compromise for peace, and silence for strength. My father understood that long before I did. The letter continued times, "Richard is responsible for his choices. Gloria is responsible for hers. You are not responsible for either." The sentence settled deep inside me, simple, obvious, and somehow revolutionary. For most of my life, I had felt responsible for everyone, keeping people happy, keeping people comfortable, keeping relationships together, even when I was the only one trying. I continued reading. "The estate is worth significantly more than $6 million. I stopped, then blinked, then reread the sentence once, twice, 3 times. My father continued times. "The liquid assets disclosed during the will reading represent only a portion of what you inherited. Additional holdings are detailed in the documents Ethan will provide." I sat motionless. The room suddenly felt very quiet. The $6 million had already seemed overwhelming. Apparently, that wasn't the full picture. A note attached to the letter directed me toward another folder inside the desk. I opened it carefully. Investment portfolios, property interests, business holdings, trust assets. The numbers were staggering, $18 million, possibly more. I stared at the documents for nearly a minute, not because I was excited, but because I was shocked. My father had built all of this quietly, carefully, and methodically, and now it belonged to me. A strange realization followed immediately. None of it mattered as much as I expected. The money was life-changing, of course it was, but after everything that had happened, another thought felt far more important. I was free. The word appeared suddenly in my mind. Free not because of the inheritance, but because of clarity, because I no longer had to pretend, no longer had to excuse, no longer had to negotiate my own worth. A knock interrupted my thoughts. Ben stood in the doorway. "There's someone here to see you." I frowned. "Who?" His expression shifted slightly. "Richard." I closed my eyes. "Of course." For several seconds I considered refusing, then I shook my head. "No, it's okay." Ben nodded and disappeared. A minute later, Richard entered the study. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He looked exhausted, older, not physically but emotionally, like a man carrying years of regret all at once. His eyes moved around the room, then settled on me. "I wasn't sure you'd agree to see me." I wasn't sure either. That earned a faint smile, one that disappeared almost immediately. Richard sat across from me. For several moments he simply stared at his hands, then finally spoke. I ruined everything. The honesty surprised me not because it wasn't true, but because it was the first truly honest thing I'd heard from him in a very long time. He looked up. I should have protected us. I didn't. I didn't answer. He continued, I should have protected you. Silence, heavy silence. Then I'm sorry. This time I believed him completely. Not because he deserved forgiveness, but because the regret sounded genuine, real, and painful. But something had changed. The apology reached me. It simply arrived too late. Richard leaned forward. Can we fix this? The question hung between us. Years earlier I would have said yes immediately. Years earlier I would have fought for us, explained, comforted, and tried again. Now I felt something different, peace. Not anger, not bitterness, peace. And peace rarely argues with reality. I looked at him carefully, then answered honestly, no. The word wasn't cruel, it wasn't triumphant. It was simply true. Richard closed his eyes briefly as if part of him already knew. When he opened them again, tears glistened. They're not dramatic tears, but quiet ones, the kind people cry when denial finally ends. I stood slowly, walked to the window, and looked out across the lake. The water shimmered beneath the afternoon sunlight. Behind me, Richard remained silent. Finally, I spoke. Dad left me many things. Richard waited. I glanced toward the letter resting on the desk, but the most important thing wasn't money. He looked at me. What was it? I smiled sadly. The courage to stop living for everyone else. Neither of us spoke after that because there was nothing left to say. A few hours later, I signed the divorce papers. My hand didn't shake. For the first time in 27 years, I wasn't ending something. I was beginning something. 1 year later, I stood in my father's kitchen watching sunlight spill across Lake Tahoe. The water glowed gold beneath the morning sky. A fresh blueberry cobbler cooled beside the window. Coffee brewed quietly in the background. And for the first time in a very long time, my life felt peaceful. Not perfect, but peaceful. The difference matters more than most people realize. For years, I believed happiness would arrive as one dramatic moment. A promotion. A vacation. A financial breakthrough. A grand gesture. Something big enough to erase years of stress. Instead, healing arrived quietly in small moments. The first morning I woke up without anxiety. Twisting in my stomach, the first weekend I spent without worrying about someone else's mood, the first holiday where nobody criticized how I cooked, dressed, spoke, or laughed. Tiny freedoms, that's what healing looked like. Tiny freedoms repeated often enough to become a life. Snow still lingered on the distant mountain peaks. The estate felt alive again, not because of the money, but because people filled it. Good people, people who brought warmth instead of tension. Ben was arguing with the delivery driver over the correct way to stack firewood. My friend Linda was arranging flowers in the dining room. Ethan had promised to arrive before dinner, though experience suggested he would be late again. Some things never change, and honestly, I liked that. I carried my coffee onto the deck. The air smelled of pine trees and fresh water. He used to sit exactly where I was sitting now, watching the lake, thinking, planning, observing, sometimes speaking, often not. When I was younger, I thought silence meant nothing. Age taught me otherwise. Some of the most important things in life happen quietly. A door closes, a truth becomes impossible to ignore. A person finally understands their own worth. None of those moments arrive with fireworks. They arrive softly. My phone vibrated with a text message. It wasn't unusual, but the sender made me pause. Richard. We hadn't spoken in nearly 6 months. The divorce had been finalized 8 months earlier. The lawsuits surrounding the house sale had eventually settled. The buyers withdrew once the ownership complications became fully understood, and financial penalties followed along with several investigations. The consequences had been substantial. I stared at the message, then opened it. Hope you're doing well. That's all it said. No requests, no guilt, no excuses, just a simple sentence. For a moment, I sat quietly looking at the lake. Then I typed a response. Times I am. A minute later, another message appeared. Times I'm glad. That was the entire conversation. And somehow it felt right, because some relationships aren't repaired. They're accepted. There is a difference. I no longer hated Richard. Truthfully, I hadn't hated him for a long time. Time has a way of softening anger. What remained was understanding. Richard wasn't destroyed by one terrible decision. He was destroyed by years of avoiding difficult decisions, years of choosing comfort over courage, years of surrendering responsibility to someone else. And eventually those choices collected their debt, as they always do. Later that afternoon, guests began arriving. Nothing extravagant, just people I cared about, people who cared about me. Laughter filled the house, music drifted through the rooms, and the scent of food floated from the kitchen. At one point, Ethan finally arrived carrying 2 bottles of wine and offering 20 minutes of excuses, nobody believed a single word of which made the teasing even better. Watching everyone laugh together, I felt something unexpected gratitude. It wasn't for the inheritance. It wasn't for the estate. It was for perspective. 1 year earlier I thought my life had ended standing in that driveway holding those divorce papers, listening to Gloria tell me I was homeless. I genuinely believed everything was falling apart. What I didn't understand then was that some things need to fall apart not because they're worthless but because they're no longer healthy. Sometimes losing the wrong people creates room for the right life. That lesson took me 47 years to learn. After dinner, the guests slowly drifted home. The house grew quiet again. The sun began sinking behind the mountains, spreading orange light across the lake. I stepped onto the deck alone, the evening air feeling cool against my skin. For a while, I simply stood there watching the water, listening to the wind moving through the trees, thinking about my father, not the inheritance, not the trust, not the money, but him, Franklin Reed, the man who saw danger long before I did, the man who protected me even after he was gone, the man who understood something. I spent decades learning love without respect isn't love, it's permission. Permission to be diminished, permission to be ignored, permission to be taken for granted. And eventually, permission becomes a habit. My father refused to let that happen to me even when I couldn't see it myself. A smile touched my face. "Dad," I said softly into the evening air, "thank you." The lake shimmered beneath the fading sunlight. For a moment, everything felt still, not empty. Still, but the kind of stillness that comes when you're finally where you're supposed to be. Standing there, I realized something important. The greatest inheritance my father left me wasn't $6 million. It wasn't an $18 million estate. It wasn't legal protection. It wasn't financial freedom. It was clarity, the courage to stop shrinking myself so other people could feel larger, the courage to stop earning love that should have been given freely, the courage to choose peace over performance. And once you learn that lesson, nobody can take it away from you. Not a spouse, not a mother-in-law, not a betrayal, nobody. The sky darkened gradually above the lake, lights appeared across the distant shoreline. The world settled into evening. And for the first time in many years I felt completely at home. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever stayed too long in a relationship, friendship, or situation that slowly chipped away at your spirit, I hope you'll remember this: it is never too late to choose yourself. It is never too late to walk away from what hurts you, and it is never too late to build a life that feels peaceful when nobody else is watching. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had a moment that completely changed how you saw yourself or the people around you? Leave a comment below and share your story. And if you enjoyed spending this time with me, please subscribe and join us. We have many more unforgettable stories to share, and I'd love for you to be part of this journey. Until next time, take care of yourself. You deserve it.